Making a tank is an expensive operation. They're hugely specialized vehicles that are designed to do two things and two things only: wage war and keep the peace. It's a big investment for the military forces of any country to invest in a tank, and so you'd expect them to serve for as long as possible and then be recycled when they retire. Things don't always turn out that way though, which is why we've been able to bring you this exciting video full of abandoned tanks. Several years ago, there were military camps in the town of Borden in England, but they're all closed down now. Sadly, it would seem that when the army left town, they forgot to pack up their tanks and take them home with them. That's left a whole collection of them rusting away in the fields where the camps used to be, seemingly with nobody to care for them. Despite the abandonment of the location, there are rumors that some of the old war machines still work. Several urban explorers who have visited the site claim to have found fresh track marks in the mud upon their visit, and also report that the tanks aren't quite where they remember them being last time they turned up. A little distance away from the collection of tanks is an old British Land Rover, partially hidden by bushes. It's squashed and crushed, almost as if one of the tanks has been used to run it over. Perhaps it was the work of some bored soldiers trying to kill time. Unsurprisingly, England is full of old Second World War ruins and wrecks, and so we're staying in the country to check out our next abandoned tank. This one is the hulking remains of an old Churchill Mark II tank, which has been hiding out in the grasslands of Storrington for 70 years. The tank once served on the front lines of the war, but was declared obsolete after suffering damage and being replaced by a more modern vehicle. From that point on, it was doomed to spend the rest of the war being used as target practice for Canadian soldiers stationed in the country. The bullet holes from that period of its existence are still visible all the way along one side of the old tank. It seems that the Canadians were good shots. Although it's definitely seen better days, this old Churchill may finally be moved to a more suitable retirement location in the near future. It will be restored during 2020 and then moved to a war museum in France. There's something almost beautiful about this old T-34 tank that has been abandoned in the sand on Socotra, especially when the sun sets behind it and paints it as a silhouette against the horizon. You should be careful about approaching it for a photo opportunity, though. It may have been abandoned for a long time, but nobody has ever come along to deactivate it or remove its weaponry. This tank is still considered armed and dangerous. It's just one of several T-34s which litter the area, all of which were imported from the Soviet Union during times of division within Yemen. The south of the country was socialist, and the north was capitalist. The Soviets had an interest in helping to protect their socialist brothers and gifted them the tanks to use against the North in the event of an invasion. The division within the country no longer exists, but the tanks remain on guard, forever watchful. They're supposed to be under armed guard, but as you can see from these pictures, the guards aren't very vigilant. The Plain of Jars in Laos is one of the most mysterious and eerie archaeological sites in the world, but also one of the most dangerous to visit. It's known that there are unexploded landmines in the area which date back to previous conflicts, and also, as if it were there as a warning, the abandoned remains of a Soviet PT-76 tank from the Vietnam War. Although Laos was supposed to be neutral during the war, the American side of the battle armed mercenaries and hill tribes to fight against Pathet Lao communists within Laos, who were armed by the North Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese were in turn armed by the Russians. Laos became the site of a proxy war, and the land was heavily scarred by bombings. One of those American bombs fell on this Russian tank, which was abandoned after the impact and considered too badly damaged to salvage. It's been here ever since, serving as a reminder that when a country goes to war, it's all too easy for neighboring lands to get caught up in the conflict. Millions of people around the world know Fort Knox in Kentucky, USA, as the place where the U.S. Treasury stores all of its gold bullion. You would therefore expect it to be heavily guarded, and it is. It looks like some of the tanks that are no longer required for guard duty have been abandoned all around its outskirts, though. There's a whole collection of abandoned tanks at Fort Knox, which has led some urban explorers labeling it as the biggest tank graveyard in America. Most of the broken down tanks to be found at the site are M60s, although there are at least 3 or 4 M48s mixed in along with them. Until 2010, there was a military base at Fort Knox, which hosted the Armor School, so it's likely these forgotten tanks are leftovers from that time. Like the Churchill tank in England, there are bullet holes down the sides of some of the M60s that suggest they were once used as target practice, but others appear to have no visible scars or marks whatsoever. Perhaps they were used as rescue and recovery vehicles. There's a lot that we can tell from these pictures of an old tank which has been left abandoned underwater. The road wheel, turret, and tracks are all still attached, and the size and shape of the vehicle confirm to us that it's an M42 Duster anti-aircraft tank built in the United States of America. That leaves just one question to answer. Why is it at the bottom of the sea in the Gulf of Aqaba in Jordan? Did it drive itself in here by accident, or was it pushed in during a battle on the beach? Actually, no, it wasn't. It was sunken here deliberately on the orders of the King of Jordan during the 1980s. The king wanted to create an artificial reef to promote the healthy growth of marine life, and he thought the tank would serve his purposes perfectly. He wasn't wrong. This might not have been the kind of protection duty the tank was designed for, but it's performed admirably. Lionfish now live inside the gun barrels, and coral has grown in and around every crevice on its body. Whether the island of Shikotan belongs to Russia or Japan is a matter for people more important than us to sort out. But the long-running dispute over its true ownership is the reason why there are so many abandoned tanks on such a small piece of land. Barely 1,000 people live on Shikotan, but there's no way of mistaking just how willing the Russians were to go to war to defend it in case the Japanese tried to reclaim it after the Second World War. The history of the island is complicated. It was Russian until 1855, but was then gifted to Japan. Russia took it back in 1945 and have theoretically owned it ever since, although Japan has never recognized the Russian claim. A whole fleet of tanks was brought to the island after the war, where they were mobilized and then half buried into the ground to act as shore batteries. The overwhelming majority of the tanks are IS-2 and IS-3s, but there are also several T-54s and T-55s here to go along with them. They're almost certainly too badly damaged to work anymore, but Japan has never risked finding out. Many of the islands in the Pacific Ocean found themselves unwittingly turned into battlefields during the Second World War, but the Solomon Islands had a bloodier time of it than most. Between the years of 1942 and 1945, more than 38,000 soldiers died here throughout a constant battle that eventually saw the Japanese driven into retreat. That was a long time ago now, but the scars and relics of those years still cover the islands. On the island of Munda, a man named Barney Paulson has been collecting some of the old relics to create an open-air battlefield museum, and the star of his collection is an American Stuart tank, which is standing in the exact same position it stopped in back in 1943, when it was immobilized by Japanese forces. It's cracked, broken, and battered, and there's a hole in it so big you can crawl through it. But there's enough of it left to get a sense of what a fearsome war machine it must have been during its prime. If old T-34 tanks are your thing, you might be pleased to know that you can find several of them on the island of Zeltukin, which belongs to Russia. You might have to move quickly if you want to see them with your own eyes, though. They're slowly being raided and ransacked by illegal steel scavengers. The collection of tanks, which also includes modified T-34-85s, were dumped on the island to be used as target practice, although some of them are veterans of real conflicts. If the metal hunters don't completely destroy what's left of them, the Russian government might soon come back for them anyway. Back in 2017, it was decided that some of the tanks would be repaired and restored for the purposes of educating children about the wars of Russia's past. They would be turned into living museum exhibits that children could climb inside and experience the same conditions that soldiers would have endured back when the tanks were active. So far, there isn't much sign of that project starting. Although German forces invaded many countries during the First World War, they never quite made it as far as Australia. The land down under has the advantage of being an island nation many miles away from Europe, and so the people there have the advantage of being able to see enemy forces approaching from a very long way away. That begs the question of how Mephisto, the very last German A7V Sturmpanzerwagen tank on the planet, ended up in Queensland. Mephisto was captured during the final months of the war, during July 1918, close to the town of Villers-Bretonneux in France. The majority of the soldiers who captured it were drawn from the 26th Battalion, who were all from Queensland. As the tank was still in good condition, they dragged it back behind Allied lines for a closer inspection, and then decided it would make the perfect war trophy. The Allied command agreed to give it to them, and so it was shipped back to Australia in June the following year after the war had ended. It spent most of its time since then inside the Queensland Museum, where it was towed by steamrollers after it came ashore. Any kind of mission that involves crossing the Antarctic is difficult. Moving vehicles and cargo is hard, slow work, and once the job of the vehicles is done, they're often left behind instead of being brought home for the return trip. That explains why this rusting old tank was left behind after an American expedition in 1939, but it took a lot of work to identify the model. It's surrounded by 3 M2A2 light tanks, but with the markings on this old vehicle worn away by time and the climate, its identity remained a mystery until the question was thrown open to the internet. Now confirmation has finally been received. There was some debate over whether it was a T3 or a T5, but it turned out to be neither. It's actually an old T3 E4 tractor. There's not much left of it now other than the engine and the tracks, but if you compare an old picture of a T3 E4 from the 1930s to the rusty Hulk, you can just about make out that they're one and the same vehicle. Returning to the time frame of World War II, the Battle of Saipan was a significant flashpoint during the Pacific Campaign, lasting from the 15th of June until the 9th of July in 1944. It doesn't get the level of attention that it deserves from historians because it occurred at the same time as the far more famous D-Day landings in Normandy. It was a fierce and brutal battle, but this semi-submerged Sherman tank never took part in it at all. Nobody's completely sure how it ended up in a lagoon, but the most likely explanation is that whoever was driving it simply misjudged the tide badly. It probably rolled into position during particularly low tide and was then swamped, abandoned, and gradually sucked further down. Amazingly, the barrel is still pointed directly at an old pillbox that has been partially destroyed. So it might be the case that the Sherman was able to fire a shot off before its occupants had to bail out. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching and see you soon!